Now we're going to move on to our next session, data and the consumer. If you've just joined us this afternoon, I'm zooming in from Wurundjeri Woiwurrung land and want to thank you for joining us from Zoom from wherever you are. So our chair for this session is Jenny Marie Patterson. Professor Patterson is a Professor of Law at the University of Melbourne. She's the co-director of the Centre for AI and Digital Ethics, CADE, a new collaborative interdisciplinary research, teaching and policy centre at the University of Melbourne. I'd love to now hand you over to Jenny to introduce our speakers. Thanks so much, Jenny.
Thanks so much, Kyla, and I'm delighted to be here. And I would also like to acknowledge the Indigenous people of the lands on which I'm living and working, who are the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders present and emerging, and note that their land has never been ceded. It's my great pleasure to be with you here today for this very interesting and exciting and really relevant panel on consent and the consumer. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time introducing our wonderful speakers because I know that you want to hear from them. But before I introduce you, I will just alert you to the beautiful artwork that some of us have behind us, which comes from the great collective that is going to be finishing this session, which is Debris Facility, and you will hear more on that later. So our speakers in order. First of all, we have Dr. Mikhail Carrington, who is a marketing academic at the University of Melbourne with a focus on consumer culture and consumer ethics. And she will be followed by Dr. Megan Prichter, who is a senior research fellow at the University of Melbourne and at the University's Centre for Digital Transformation of Health. And then lastly, but not leastly, we have Dr. Tyne Sumner, who is a postdoctoral research fellow in the School of Culture Communication at the University of Melbourne. So 3 complementary and fascinating presentations for you, which I'm sure you'll enjoy. Over to you, Mikhail.
Brilliant. Okay, so while the PowerPoint presentation is coming up, I would also like to acknowledge that I live and work as a guest on Wadawurrung country, which is actually just outside of Geelong. It's absolutely beautiful country, and I'm incredibly fortunate to be a guest here on these lands. And I pay my respects to the elders of the Wadawurrung people, past, present, and future. And I'm going to be focusing my talk today specifically on consumer choice and consent in the digital space, in the digital universe, because this very much represents the frontier of marketing today in terms of how we understand marketing theory, but definitely marketing practice. So I'm really focusing on that digital space. And consumer choices in digital realms go well beyond giving choice to consent to cookies, which is often what we think of when we think of choice and consent in digital and consumer. Those cookies that infiltrate and monitor our every move online, they really are just the tip of the iceberg. Contemporary consumers are increasingly plugging into incredibly complex and almost untraceable and uncontrollable networks. These consumers, we now say, are becoming post-human as they meld with the machine. And I'm just going to ask for the slide to go forward, where that machine is actually a network. So consumers are becoming post-human when they meld with this machine, because as consumers, we are becoming cyborgs. Cyborgs enmeshed in an infrastructure that links together material. So when I'm talking about material, I'm talking about smartphones, laptops, products, with the social and cultural. When I talk social and cultural, I'm thinking celebrity, for example, social media influencer, and melding that all together with the digital. So social media platforms, Google search engines, hashtags, visual memes, etc., etc. And when all of these social, cultural, online, offline, physical, digital threads meld and fuse together, the result is powerful and it's unpredictable. And as consumers welded within these ecosystems, we are just one part of this entire network, and we are not at the center of this universe. There aren't very many universes we are at the center of, and we are certainly not at the center of this really diffuse and complex universe. And the outcomes of that can be unpredictable, sometimes unintended, and very often hidden. So I'll just ask for the next slide, please. Thank you. So these socio-technological ecosystems are actually really, really sticky. Once we are connected in, it's actually very hard to get out. Next slide. Sorry, I'm going to keep on saying that. It's really irritating. To become part of what we suggest is you're actually part of this network. You're part of the universe. You're part of the connective tissue. And once you become part of that connective tissue, it's so sticky. It's so hard to get out, which is why social media platforms like Pinterest exemplify this intense engagement that consumers have when they scroll, when they collect, when they pin images, you know, really getting that materiality going with the digital. And the addictive nature of Pinterest in particular has been aptly called digital crack for women. And I'm sure there's quite a few of you out there who engage in Pinterest or the social media kind of network out there who are probably smiling to yourself and nodding, because we're part of these infrastructures. Next slide, please. Thank you. And the next one. Yep. Brilliant. Thank you. So in these socio-technological ecosystems, we're talking about consent. When we talk about consent, we're talking about power and control. And power and control are not equally distributed throughout this network. Power imbalances exist between the consumer and this socio-technological universe out there, of which they are only one small thread and one small part. For example, Google search engines are powerful network builders that control really complex digital matrices of keywords. Moreover, social media have systems of control coded into the platform through big data, predictive analytics that curate specific content for individual consumers to make them stick in that network. So the power to choose and the power to consent is redistributed away from the human to the social media ecosystem. And I'll just ask you to click one more, thanks. The technological ecosystems, they exert what has been suggested to be a gigantic gravitational field that actually bends consumers' desire in the direction that is desired by the network. Now, this particular study, this particular authors, they actually did a study on food porn, and they were looking at food porn online, and they talked about gravitational fields. I'd probably think about electromagnetic fields, but we all get the point, and we all understand the point that's being made. And we probably see ourselves sometimes in this situation. But, and I'll ask to move to the next slide, because the exciting thing really is that this isn't the end of the story. We aren't living in this completely dystopian environment, because the networks and the distributions of power, control, choice, and consent within these socio-technological ecosystems can be leveraged, can be subverted, and can be resisted by consumers on their own and consumers in groups as collectives. For example, marginalized people often use social media systems themselves to become informed, to connect with others, to organize, and to protest. So we understand that there is wiggle room. Leeway does exist in this post-human infrastructure of cyborg consumers. And I'll just ask if we could just go forward. One more slide, please. So we understand and we know that consumers can move between the cracks to bend these networks to their own will and purposes. And this particularly happens and is effective on a collective level when consumers can group together to really build that gravitational or that electromagnetic force. So social movements like Black Lives Matters, Je suis Charlie, Me Too, the Arab Spring Revolt, for example, all demonstrate how social media movements can actually redirect this power and force, control and consent within socio-technological systems to actually bring about lasting change, significant change in the real world. And there's wiggle room and space for individual consumers as well. And I'll just ask you to click one more time, please, because at an individual level, the power to consent and to choose in the midst of all of these networks can actually be redistributed when the consumer starts to become active and productive and use the resources within that ecosystem to their own ends, to work for them, to really enhance their capacities. For example, leveraging the resources within an ecosystem to overcome resistive cultural and structural barriers such as gender bias. And I'm giving you a specific example here from my own research with my dear friend and colleague, Julia Azan, that we've just recently published. We did a study into understanding the online lives of celebrity watchers, and this particular informant of ours, Emily, talks about how she uses the resources within these networks by looking across a whole lot of different celebrities and just picking the bits and pieces that are going to work for her and enhance her capability. And she talks about when she's having one of those days when she doesn't feel confident, she takes those resources, she puts on her celebrity face, and then she's fierce and she can go out and conquer the world. So we can see that there is wiggle room here for consumers. So just moving forward now to my final slide to suggest that in socio-technological ecosystems, you know, in this post-human futuristic environment that we actually now, when we talk about futuristic, it's actually the here and now that we find ourselves living and working and consuming in. If we think about that, we are now understanding that this ebb and flow of power is actually complex and constantly unfolding. So these systems of control and the ability to consent within a marketplace are actually very fluid and very contested. And that's it from me. So I thank you so much for listening. And I'm going to immediately, thank you so much, T, for going through those slides. I'm going to be immediately passing the baton to Megan. So thank you so much, Megan.
So I'm from Melbourne Law School. I'm joining you from the beautiful lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations and pay my deep respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I'm going to be speaking today on a very complementary topic to what we've just heard about, specifically on new health technology and data proliferation in the health research and healthcare contexts. So for those who tuned in yesterday and heard the fantastic keynote by Professor Claire Delaney, it's very clear from what Claire presented that the principle of informed consent for health research and for healthcare and for data collection in the health space is really critical. It's really highly valued, and it's been adopted and promulgated in legal instruments and in guidance by public institutions and professional bodies internationally. It's part of Australian law, it's part of our ethical guidelines for health research. But butting up against that centrality of informed consent is the real world fact that people who are being asked to give their consent in health contexts often don't understand the information that they're presented with. Consent information is pitched at a really high level. It requires quite a degree of education, of literacy to understand. It's also often really long and really boring, and it assumes that we have the motivation, the time, the skills and the access to information and potentially to online tools to be able to give truly informed consent. So that's a problem in healthcare, where we place such focus and value so highly the concept of informed consent. And so researchers over many decades now have tried to solve this problem by improving consent processes in healthcare. And they've done this in part by conducting randomized trials, comparing standard consent mechanisms to some type of enhanced consent approach. And that enhanced approach might involve something like giving people more time to read information, using multimedia tools for extra engagement, reducing the complexity of the information, presenting it in plain language, in different styles of text, and so on. And so there is some good evidence from that research that it's possible to improve someone's informedness as they're making healthcare decisions. How do we figure out if somebody is actually more informed? Well, there's many, in fact, over 1,000 different tools have been used to measure how informed a choice someone is making, whether they're joining a clinical trial or agreeing to have a particular medical treatment. And to try and refine and improve this field, Katie Gillies and colleagues in Scotland have recently published an international standard set of consensus-driven outcome measures for informed consent. And although it's specific to the clinical trial context, I think it has a lot of validity in healthcare more generally. And some of the key outcomes that we might measure if we're thinking, is somebody actually informed when they're making a choice, includes their sense of empowerment, how much they know and understand about what they're agreeing to, and how helpful that process was for decision making. So just to sum up, consent is really, really important in healthcare, but it's really, really hard but it can also be improved. That process can be improved, and we have some good ideas about how to do that. Into that space, we drop new health technologies, which suddenly create plumes of data that we seem to trail behind us everywhere we go. So of course we hand over our health data in the regular kind of ways. We go to see the GP, or we admit it to hospital and someone writes something in our medical record. But now, of course, unless we're one of the 10% of the population that's opted out of my health record, that data also is pooled in a national repository owned by the Australian government. But health data is collected in a whole bunch of other ways as well, of course. Implanted devices, or devices that attach to people, like insulin pumps, generate data. We go for screening for a particular condition, or we have a vaccination. Our information is added to a register. It might be a national register, such as a cancer screening register. We have a genetic test. Our data goes off and is developed by a commercial provider or a pathology company. We might choose to wear a Fitbit to measure our sleep or our exercise levels or our heart rate, generating data. But health data also emerges and flows around in contexts we might not expect. Our online shopping order at Woolworths or Coles reveals a lot about our health. Have we ordered a lot of pain-killing medication this week? Have we purchased a pregnancy test? So you can see that the proliferation of health data and also the Google searches we might do generates a lot of information about us that we almost can't help but leave behind. The additional challenge comes from the fact that the health data doesn't just stay where it lands. It then is repurposed, resold, repackaged, perhaps de-identified, perhaps not de-identified. And health data is particularly attractive to lots of different users for lots of different purposes. So commercial entities such as electronic medical record software vendors are sitting on large pools of patient data that they might seek to repurpose both for their own product development or to sell off for different research purposes. Google will obviously monetize our search histories to enable targeted advertising. Hospitals and universities and other not-for-profit entities also really keen to get their hands on our health data to solve some of the really pressing questions in healthcare: how to manage chronic disease, how to solve long-standing genetic problems. And finally, governments also are interested in our health data, possibly not for health-related reasons. It can aid compliance activities between different agencies and data matching. And so I imagine that we both trail this health data everywhere, and then so how can we possibly give informed consent in these new contexts where health data is exploding? is it possible ever to give consent at that point where we initially agree to hand over our health data to someone that can deal with all of those future uses that we don't know about? Well, probably not in traditional consent contexts. And so we've got new consent tools, online tools have been developed by researchers in the past decade or so. There's been quite a lot of work in this area to try and address some of these issues. So one that I'd like to talk about today in brief is called dynamic consent, and this is work led by Professor Jane Kay at Oxford and others internationally. Dynamic consent is an approach or a concept rather than an off-the-shelf product. It's configured as an online consent and communication portal or platform that provides a secure online record of consent choices over time. And its most obvious use in the context it's been developed in relates to large-scale longitudinal health data collection for unknown future research. And it's also been used in an area called biobanking, where tissue samples are collected and stored in a biobank for unknown future research use. And so dynamic consent has certain features that make it suitable for these kinds of environments. It's granular, it breaks down, rather than presenting us with an all or nothing decision, we can consent to some uses of our data, but not others. So if you imagine a dynamic consent portal at your GP, you might say, okay, I'm happy for my GP to have my data to aid my healthcare, and I'm happy for them to share my de-identified data with a university researcher, but not with a commercial entity, for example. We can consent to everything, we can consent to some things and not others, or nothing at all. Dynamic consent is conceived as an extended relationship between the healthcare consumer and the users of their data. It's easier for a person to revisit and revoke their consent over time, so to reflect in 6 months or 12 months, am I still happy with what I've agreed to, or do I want to change my mind? But as well as offering a consent tool, dynamic consent is also conceptualized as a communication pathway between the consumer and the data users. So for instance, researchers can give feedback to people who've given informed consent for their data use to say, okay, well, we have used your data in this way for this project, and these were the findings. And researchers can also invite people to participate in new uses of their data that weren't conceptualized at the start of the process. And obviously, being an online tool, dynamic consent is able to include some of the supportive approaches that I mentioned earlier that we know improve the quality of people's consent. Sounds great, right? I think it sounds fantastic. It's been floating around for about 10 years, and every time somebody new hears about it, they seize on it as the solution to this problem of healthcare data proliferation. But does it actually work? I think it's really important, and some of my work has been around the effort to make sure that dynamic consent technologies are evaluated, and that can draw on the existing substantial body of research on informed consent in healthcare that's already happened pre the internet age. But dynamic consent also may disadvantage certain people. Some of us just want to tick that box and get on with things, right? We don't want to have to engage in a long conversation because we're premising our decision-making on trust. And so we just don't want to take the time to fully engage in that, in thinking through that decision. And on the other side of things, dynamic consent platforms are quite expensive. They take quite a bit of time and effort to develop. And so because it's not an off-the-shelf product yet anyway, it's not an easy or quick solution to the problem of informed consent in healthcare. So is this all just too difficult are we completely unable to regulate the explosion of health data that we're currently facing? Well, I think it is important to remember that consent is just one of the pillars of ethical and legal use of our health data. We don't have to place all of our reliance upon it to protect the uses of our data. So of course, there are laws about how our health data can be used, and health data falls in a category of data treated under the law as especially sensitive and needing special protection. We have recourse if something goes wrong, if someone uses our data in a way that we didn't agree to or that doesn't meet the legal requirements. And healthcare professionals and researchers are also, it's hammered home to them their obligations to protect our health information. And data governance committees in health research contexts oversee these processes.
Wonderful, thank you. Hi everyone. Thanks for attending our session today. It's a privilege to speak on this important topic of consent alongside my fellow panelists. And it's also a privilege to be able to do so on stolen Aboriginal land. And I acknowledge that the land that I'm on is the unceded land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respect to Wurundjeri elders past and present. So I actually want to begin my short talk today with a recent literary text that helps us think in new and challenging ways about consent, but also about other pressing social concerns, such as surveillance, artificial intelligence, learning technologies, and predictive analytics. And that is just here, Kazuo Ishigiro's recent novel, Clara and the Sun. So this novel is set in a speculative future where education, digital education in a sense, takes place in a dispersed, socially enmeshed digital form. And it's delivered by artificial intelligence machines, affectionately known in the novel as AFs, artificial friends. The novel's protagonist, Clara, is one of these, and she belongs to a group of androids who serve children and young adults, simultaneously playing the role of teacher, companion, and sort of quasi-housemaids. And so for reasons that become clear over the course of the novel, the teenagers are also homeschooled by those given the name of screen professors. And the result between the schooling delivered by the AFs, the artificial friends, and the screen professors, we end up in a somewhat nightmarish scientism where education is delivered seemingly constantly on digital platforms, screens, artificial friends, all of which permeate the lives of the teenagers. And even when she's not engaging in teaching per se, Clara is as watchful as a parent with a newborn baby. At one point she reports, "I looked over to Josie and could tell from her posture and her breathing that she wasn't sleeping in her usual way." So the children are constantly watched, constantly learning, always accessible, and they live in a milieu of pervasive surveillance, all of which in the novel seems geared towards the ultimate goal of education and self-improvement. And what we really find troubling as this story develops isn't so much the technology itself, but its insidious normalization and its increasing ubiquity in the young adults' lives. Specifically, whether they get a say in how implicated they are in the regimes of watching, monitoring, and education, and therefore what form consent might take in a digital environment that's otherwise assumed to be a good thing because it facilitates accessibility, hybrid learning, flexibility, and so on. And so my point here is that Ishigiro's novel is fictional futurism, but it speaks directly to issues of consent in the visibility trap of recent shifts to online learning. This online learning is accelerated by the pandemic, where the shift to educational technology has now become bound up in a whole range of paradoxes. It facilitates and empowers access and equity, while at the same time has been increasingly used as a cover for increasingly invasive surveillance practices. As David Lyne and others have written, digitally supported surveillance can take many forms, not necessarily good nor bad, but taking place right in front of us and often without our knowledge or consent. And many of these platforms claim to increase efficiency, engagement, or impact, but at the same time, they also increase what Lucas Melgarco has called the quantification of academic labor, and that which Gary Hall has labeled the micro-entrepreneurship of the self. My point in this talk is to point out how this has become especially acute in the context of pedagogy, where urgent shifts to adopt new technologies for online education have exposed students and teachers to insidious forms of electronic monitoring, analysis, and control. As Niels van Doorn asks, quoting here, "How does one value something one cannot and often does not want to see? How do contemporary digital platforms and their infrastructures of connectivity, evaluation, and surveillance affect the relationship between value and visibility? And similarly, other scholars in this space, such as Morgan Luck, have highlighted that some of the risks associated with universities establishing virtual learning environments are that the adoption of surveillance technologies may result in students, especially the most gifted, feeling pressured to adopt practices that are not best suited to achieving their ideal learning outcomes. This critique often focuses on problems that arise from the augmentation of online resources folders, a kind of unidirectional means of sharing information from teacher to student, what could now be thought of in a sense as a surveillance tool, a feature that's used to attach virtual classrooms to monitor how they're being used. All of these issues and paradoxes have as much to do with the intricacies of the digital platform infrastructures themselves, I want to suggest, as what they have to do with the cultural environments that we allow to emerge from them. Being online in an educational technology sense, today at least, means being visible, accessible, available, and therefore on demand in the various forms that that takes. But I want to just query, what does consent mean in relation to the constant need to be on demand and visible, both for the teacher and the student? And one of the angles I just want to tease out here is that perhaps it's become, or increasingly is becoming, measurable by time. The time that we're agreeing to give away. Time that in these environments is stretched and configured in different ways as the immediacy and availability of online learning take over. On-demand content, accessible anywhere, anytime, has the effect of collapsing space and time boundaries that previously allowed us the flexibility to carve out our own social and pedagogical experiences, to move between, to move away, to linger and to be late. And so again, we have another paradox. While these digital platforms increase access to learning experiences of all kinds, what has also become apparent is that they have an increasing and insidious power to squeeze our time in efficiency-driven ways, to surveil our time in ways beyond our recognition or control. Take, for example, the sudden expectation that we now all arrive to, say, a Zoom call precisely on time. This has usurped our choice or autonomy to simply run late. And in a world of rising algorithmic precision and predictive analytics, I want to ask whether the art of the dawdle, the meander, all of these things has been lost to monitoring's insidious control. Did we actually consent to becoming so on time all the time, or was it taken from us right under our noses? One of the greatest pleasures and subversive acts of the student, after all, is to loiter, to move between classes, to perambulate and to ponder, to walk in 5 minutes late to class without an eyebrow raised. And so to finish, just to turn back to Clara and the Sun, without, don't worry, giving away any plot spoilers, the idea of consent becomes a central preoccupation of the novel. As the artificial friends gain increasing visibility and control over the children, only the best and brightest children have access to the latest model androids, thus creating a system where submission to and consent to surveillance is rewarded with access to more sophisticated technology. And so while many of the characters begin to resist this dystopian formulation, it nevertheless sends a chilling and dire warning about where things could head in the future if we don't stop and think critically about the relationship between learning, surveillance, and consent. And I'll leave it there and hand back over to Jeannie. Thank you.
Well, I find it interesting that for a session headed consent or titled consent, actually what all of you talked about is power. So I'm going to ask you to unpack that a little bit more in our short, but no doubt meaningful question time. And I'm going to start actually with Mikhail, who talked about, you talked about consumers in a web in a web of relationships with digital technology, with each other, with objects. And then you talked about the potential for subversion, and you gave us some examples of that. But I thought it was interesting that you subtly moved at that point from consumers to citizens and political action. And the examples you gave are, in fact, one might have been criticised as commodified political action. It's political action or subversion for the sake of the audience, for the profile on Instagram or Snapchat or Twitter. And I wondered if you could talk to us a little bit more about this interesting relationship between consumer, or this interesting concept of the consumer citizen, which I think came through so powerfully and interestingly in your talk.
Yeah, thank you, Jenny. And that's actually something that I'm really interested in, this kind of, I guess we're one person, and sometimes it depends on the setting. We talk about ourselves as consumers. Sometimes we talk about ourselves as citizens. Sometimes we identify with both. And it's actually a theme that I'm working quite a lot on at the moment in other spheres and in other probably political areas like consumption of modern slavery and those kinds of things. And I guess that I suppose what's coming out of our research is that there are times when consumers are so tightly bound that as a consumer, I feel like I have no wiggle room. I can't move. So, but I still want to act. And how do I act? How do I make a difference? How do I change? Well, I may not be able to make a difference as a consumer. I feel so tightly bound, whether it be because of the choices that are presented to me, and I need to make a choice, and those choices are so constrained, or whether it be perhaps social or other pressures that I feel I have no choice as a consumer. What we're finding is that people, and I'll call them people, feel that actually I can take civic action. And so I may not be able to change at the moment how I'm consuming, but I can change how I'm behaving, participating in society as a citizen rather than a consumer. And so it's taking those civic actions. So, and sometimes we might look at, perhaps picking up a cause like Me Too and putting it on our social media, and maybe looking at it perhaps cynically as more of a, kind of projection of identity than actually looking to make a change. But when you pull all of those little actions together at a aggregate level, we are actually seeing change. So while at an individual level, we might feel cynical about why that person's doing that, but actually we see real change in the real world. And I think that, for example, the Black Lives Matters campaign is actually a really great example of that, where there were changes and continue to be changes in legislation in the US. So, we could break it down to individual motivation, but when we look at it at an aggregate level, we are seeing mass change. And it's, I guess, one way that we can get that wiggle room. And I think that's actually a really interesting point that you've picked up on, Jeannie, that, that wiggle room often manifests in civic action rather than consumer action.
Thank you. Perhaps we are always consumer citizens now, so I'm really interested in hearing more of that work. Megan, I think these themes also came through in your presentation, because you seem to me gave us a somewhat ambivalent presentation about consent and informed consent, and even dynamic consent, which, as you said, is the gold standard in this space. And I think you were very aware of the pressures, both the aspiration to involve consumers or patients in decision making, but the pressures on that happening, partly because there's so many questions and indeed so much data collection, and partly because the sheer overwhelmingness of the decisions people are being asked to make. So I think it's a fascinating but difficult area. And Michael Wood in the chat has actually, confronted this head on and said, you didn't mention coercion. When we go to a GP, we sign a privacy statement, which is for many pages long, contains sharing provisions. It's a consent document, but it's compulsory if we want to receive the service. do you have some comments on this?
Yeah, thanks, Jenny. That's really interesting reflection. And thanks, Michael, for the question and the very good point that I didn't mention coercion. Of course, you know, I had been going to start my presentation referring to the findings out of the Nuremberg trials, which really prioritised the central role of consent in healthcare research in particular. And of course, that emphasises the need to make an informed choice without any duress, without any coercion. Otherwise, consent isn't really valid consent. I do think it's incredibly difficult. I mean, I do take your point about, yes, we're kind of caught up in these consent practices that we've always done. And I was thinking that, you know, often the people that I work with might be interested in exploring different types of consent methodologies when they're doing their own research. But in fact, there's pushback from the ethics committees that just want you to use the form, this very long form that the universities developed as a template, because it's kind of safe and it's there and it's available. So it's a very difficult habit to break for people who are using certain materials for consent. And while I sympathise with the patients in this context, I also have to say I sympathise with the doctors a little bit too, because often these are not choices that they're making deliberately. And I was reflecting about one project I'm involved with that has recruited multi-site clinical practices to a trial. And the consent form for all of the doctors for the patients in those practices requires that you agree to your information being put into a record that is then available across the whole different set of clinical practices, whether you like it or not. And I doubt that the doctors have a lot of say in that if they're going to be employed by those entities. So we could, of course, go on to talk about consent and My Health Record, but I think I'm probably going to put a pin in that for the sake of time and hand back to Jeannie.
Thank you so much. Tyne, I'll turn to you now. Tyne, you spoke a lot about, you started with the premise of consent and then led us into this actually not too far away world of, I think you said hyper education and constant surveillance of children in the name of children's wellbeing. I thought that was a really interesting reflection on consent, because certainly in the legal field, we often talk about a consent to do things. I consent to participate. And indeed, from what you spoke about, what we've actually lost and perhaps what we need to manage to consent to is to withdraw, to be alone, to have private spaces, which is almost an inversion of our traditional idea of consent, and indeed our traditional idea of what it means to be in the home, to have a private space, to be a child, in fact, which is freedom from obligation. I wondered, therefore, what you thought about how we regain this space to be, this space to explore, this space to be private in an age where we are necessarily, and our children are necessarily constantly online. Do we need an active subversion the way Mikhail spoke about?
Maybe we all do, yes. Great question, Jeannie. I don't have the immediate answer to sort of how to scale back. And I suppose what I wanted to touch on a lot in this talk is the ways in which consent becomes sort of fuzzy or becomes slippery in the context of rapid upheaval, or in the context of, in the case of online learning and the pandemic, a scramble to find a replacement. And so the things that we take most for granted, like the ability to have privacy, the ability to, in a really quite literal sense, achieve a side-on viewpoint for a learning experience, have suddenly become totally disrupted and put back together again in the kind of easiest and fastest online solution. And you really do feel, in ways we just talked about with the doctor and the patient, for both teacher and student as well. It isn't a kind of unidirectional paradigm where consent's being taken away for the benefit of the other kind of actor. It's a kind of confused maelstrom of a new environment where surveillance has become pervasive on the part of the student and the teacher. But just back to your original point, Jeannie, on power, because I think that's really interesting for some of the conversations we're having across the papers. And it makes me think of the actual, I suppose, etymology of the word consent. What do we actually mean by this word? Where did it come from? And, you know, many of the definitions that kind of go back to its Latin usage, consentiere, are actually about agreement and accord, and a kind of sense that you feel something together. So it's not that you have a neutral actor who grants consent. You actually agree that there's an environment in which you're both or collectively going to operate. And I think the classroom in the digital context has become a space where these things are being kind of renegotiated and re-teased out, because what we're seeing is through the kind of digital solutions to dispersed learning environments, we're actually returning to some of the disciplinary regimes of the 19th century that we decided were a bad idea. When I say we, I just mean a sort of a general context of higher education and so on. You know, the idea that the late 19th century whole of class model has every student facing the front. We moved away from that, and now we've kind of come back to it. So this, I guess the point is, what happens to the slippery slope of consent when you have mass upheaval and a rush to find technological solutions to sort of geopolitical problems like the pandemic?
Thank you so much, Tyne. I think you've given us a lot to think about, and indeed the whole of the panel has given us so much to think about. And I think if there's anything that we take away from this panel, it's that consent is almost a deceptive notion. There's so much sitting behind it. Power is always part of the conversation, but I think also all of our speakers have given us a much more nuanced version of the power of technology in our lives, that power can be used in different directions, that there are possibilities for subversive action, for rethinking our relationship, and for finding our own quiet spaces, to return to Tyne's point. So unfortunately, we have to finish our conversation here. I'm sure we could go on for days, but I'm sure everybody would like to join me in thanking our marvellous panellists in the way of the normal convention, which is to clap quietly on screen or to put some icon on electronically. So I'll do the old-fashioned version, but thank you very much, panellists. It was absolutely fascinating, and academia is in very good hands.
Sure is, Jeannie. Thanks so much for your fantastic chairing of that really wonderful discussion. So grateful to all of the panellists today for really just bringing such a great discussion to the table. I will now move you directly to Debris Facility Pty Limited, who is going to close out the day with a creative presentation. Debris Facility is a white settler, queer body corporate founded in 2015. Over to you, Debris.
Hi, thanks. Good afternoon. I'm Debris Facility, a representative of the Debris Facility Proprietary Limited. As a white settler, I acknowledge the sovereign owners of the lands on which we work, the Wurundjeri, Woiwurrung and Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nations. So we're here to present a commissioned video for consent, data and the consumer, titled User Agreements, which is a 14-minute video work deploying methods from concrete poetry to parasitically inhabit notions of datification, machine listening, administrative violence and evasion. If possible, please get some headphones to listen to the work, and please excuse the data lag on this Zoom medium. There will be a version of captions with the script being dropped into the chat box, which you can use. Otherwise, we recommend full screen attention. We're extremely pleased to have worked with Arben Jika, who worked producing the score for the work, and Charlie Sofo, who worked on videography and teaching editing. This work has been developed with the Liquid Architecture and Redux machine listening instrument. So special thanks to Joel Stern and Sean Dockeray. We're thankful for the invitation from Kyla McFarlane, the Ian Potter and Kova, and we're proud to share this afternoon with Tyne Sumner, Mikhail Carrington, Megan Prichter, and Jeannie Patterson. Input, consultation, and assistance to the project has come from Ruth D'Souza, Tyne Sumner's Lyric High, Pi O's Big Numbers, Mackenzie Walk's Capital is Dead, Primary Information's Women in Concrete Poetry Anthology, Leon Luscombe, Javid DaCosta, Nick Caldry and Ulysses Majors, Data Colonialism, Dean Spade's Normal Life, Administrative Violence, Critical Trans Politics and the Limits of the Law, Justy Parika's Insect Media, and Nicholas Mangan's Termite Economy. Solidarity with our colleagues at the Victorian College of the Arts, Melbourne University, Liquid Architecture Sound Incorporated, Artery Cooperative Studios, and the Debris Facility Proprietary Limited. Thank you to the audience for your attention this afternoon. If you could please start the video, Ty.